Welcome to Indigenous Action, where we dig deep into critical issues impacting our communities throughout occupied North America.
This is an autonomous, anti-colonial broadcast with unapologetic and claws-out analysis towards total liberation.
So take your seat by this fire, and may the bridges we burn together light our way.
Part of the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network, channelzero.com.
Okay, yay! I'm super excited to be here with you two. Thank you. Yay. Thank you so much for your time. I've been really dying to have this conversation, especially with two radical badasses like you. And I want to give a shout out and a recommendation for our listeners to read the 17th edition of the Muchacha fanzine, which is what inspired the conversation of reclaiming Indigenous feminism, or adding to the conversation that's already been taking place for a long time now, which is abolition feminism. And we can thank our strong Black women in history for starting those conversations in their homes and with each other as to what abolition feminism is. And I'm so excited to again contribute to that conversation and contribute more of an Indigenous lens and Indigenous analysis to the topic of feminism in general. And what the zine does a really great job of doing is kind of pointing out all of the shortcomings and flaws in white liberal feminism, or hashtag girl boss feminism. That's basically just like perpetuating patriarchy, but just putting a femme or like woman's face on it. So
put a bow on it.
Yeah, put a bow on it. I'm like, sorry, gals, but when your feminism is just, becoming the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, you're actually not actually practicing feminism. And so we're going to go into a lot of reasons why white liberal feminism is just not working for us, and how it erases non-white, non-cis-het female identities within its practices, and so on and so forth. And then again, coming from a stance of total abolition and Indigenous liberation. And I'll be one of your hosts today. My name is Bon. My pronouns are they, them. I'm Coco Pa. And currently I reside in so-called Flagstaff, which is a sacred place for 13 Indigenous communities in this region. And I'm excited to be here again. And joining me as a host today is Amra.
Yay! I'm so excited about this topic and all the rage and anger that I feel towards fucked up heteropatriarchy. So I'm ready to get down with you all. My name is Amra, and my pronouns are she and her, or if you're using Spanish, ella. And I am O'odham, Mexican, and European, and my father's family is from Yuma, Arizona, part of the historic and not currently federally recognized O'odham people from that western part of the O'odham Jilid. And I am excited to talk about this because I feel like it's really important for us to think about how is our view on feminism different? Why is it important? What does adding the word Indigenous to it mean? And it's not, I love how you framed it, Bon. It's not trying to be like a white man. That is not the goal. It's not my goal anyway. No. So I'm really excited to talk about that and to think through this together. And I'm also excited for our guest today, Teloa, and hope you can introduce yourself.
Chokma Sahochifwat Taloa, so-called Northern Arizona Ako Antali, Chikasha Saya. My name is Taloa, and my pronouns are he, him, or they, them. I am residing in so-called Northern Arizona at the moment, and I am Chickasaw. I'm also a drag artist, beater, sewer, writer, etc. So I'm here to open up this discussion and also bring like an artistic perspective, because art is extremely vital to revolutionary praxis, and it can't just be all work and no play. So
Thank you for the
Awesome.
reminder.
Yes, we need to dance. So, before we get started in our discussion today, we're gonna do a newish thing for the podcast, which is we're gonna give you some frontline news updates, sort of our intro into what's happening around Indian country right now, and then we'll build our conversation kind of in relation to the current news. So, one of the things that just happened this weekend was in the world of sports.
Ew.
There was the Super Bowl in Autumn Homelands, happened in so-called Phoenix, Akama Autumn, part of the Jovid, and it was two awful teams. You can tell my love of, like, I like different sports. I'll just say that. But yeah, so there's, like, the two teams that represent, variations on the theme of racist, anti-Indigenous mascot, the Kansas City Chiefs and the Philadelphia Eagles. I always wonder if they're like equating us to animals, right? Like an eagle and an Indian together. So, in the dehumanization of the practice that is the racist Indigenous mascot. And the mainstream media reported that there was a presence of Indigenous people protesting the representation outside of the game, but they downplayed how many people were there. A lot of the mainstream coverage just said there was about 50 people, and it wasn't really that significant for Native people to be out there protesting the logo and the chants and the horrifically white supremacist ways that the fans act, dehumanizing our people. But when we looked at social media coverage of the event, videos from people who were there, it looked like there was probably 2 to 3 times that, at least 100, 250 people, possibly more, who came out, fought through traffic, and dealt with the, overpricing of parking and all that bullshit to go and protest these racist representations of our peoples. And some of the signs were, just reading like, nope, like we just don't want this, and end cultural appropriation. There was a lot of really creative signage. You can send us on our socials great, images you have of signs or chants. We always love that. But the protesters kept asking for the teams to change, these racist representations and retire the name, especially the Chiefs and their arrowhead logo and their tomahawk chop, which is like this racist, like, minstrel kind of activity that they will do, pretending to be Native folks in this horribly offensive way when the fans make a chopping hand gesture and pretend that they're chanting a war song. It's just incredibly awful and dehumanizing and offensive. So people were out there protesting that. And we'll come back to this topic and how we all feel about it in a sec. But going on to the next news item.
Yeah, next up, we just want to take a moment to honor the life that was lost out in so-called Atlanta in the Weelaunee Forest, Tortuguita or Tort. They were a trans Indigenous, also immigrant, I believe, anarchist, and they were out there. They were a medic defending the forest and were tragically executed by the police ever since the event happened, there has been, the mainstream media has just been parroting the police narrative, which here we always know that the police narrative is a lie and that anything they say is to cover their own asses. So we just want to take a moment to honor their legacy and honor the fact that people aren't going to stop defending the land. We here side with the land, we side with the ecosystems and the people who protect it. We refuse the police narrative and the mainstream media's narrative. And we're not going to forget you, Tort. Like, we're still out here fighting just as hard, and the movement is only growing now.
Yes. Rest in power, Tort. We love you. And I'm excited to share a little when we get back into that conversation. I actually got to spend some time out in so-called Atlanta a week or two ago here. So that'll be, some frontline takes on what's going on post Tort's murder on that. In even more news, Nathan chasing horse. Dun, dun, dun. Disgusting. Yucky. Boo. But we all knew it. And I cannot believe it took this long.
Seriously.
For someone to groom 5 wives from childhood into being this man's husband. How did it take this long? I don't understand. But story is that 46-year-old pedophile Nathan Chasing Horse. So for those who don't know, he's like most well known for his role in Dances with Wolves. He was the racist stereotype of a medicine man. He was taken into custody in Las Vegas, and of course he lived in Las Vegas. And that happened on January 31st, and he was taken in on 2 counts of sexual exploitation of children and 1 count of possession of child pornography. And trigger warning, the rest of, what we've already been talking about and the rest of what we're talking about is going to have to do with rape, sexual abuse, and other absolute injustices that we, kind of operate within our everyday lives as like queer people, as femmes, as Indigenous people, etc. So apologies for not having given a content warning at the beginning of this show. I think that sometimes just signifies that we're so used to talking about things like this in our, in our kitchens, with each other, through social media, etc. So apologies for that, but the rest of this conversation will be pretty heavy and deep around those topics. So said child pornography, in which he was taken into custody for on just 1 count, was pornography of his own making. He was reported to be raping a girl, said to be between the ages of 11 and 13.
Disgusting.
Yeah. It's horrifying. And, unfortunately, this is not something that's feels very shocking. When we think of especially the MMIW G2ST movement, and like how that relates to these conversations and the normalization of pedophilia. And one of the ways in which, Nathan Chasing Horse was able to get away with these abuses for so long has a lot to do with the rape culture that we live in, and how that's directly related to the the disappearance and murder of Indigenous women. And so, Nathan Chasing Horse led a cult called The Circle. And he actually, throughout the span of his initiation and leadership of this cult, he kept a detailed journal, which if you're as sick as me, you can't wait to see like what the fuck was going on and who the people are accountable for letting this happen for so fucking long. Because surely
Name the enablers.
Enablers. Get the enablers too. Please.
Exactly.
Please, honey. There was 24 supporters for Nathan Chasing Horse
disgusting.
in the courtroom and more outside when his trial took place. And they were holding signs that translated to "Justice for Chasing Horse."
Ugh.
And
like he's some kind of victim.
Yeah.
It's so disgusting.
He's a victim of the state. He's a victim of the state that allowed him to perpetuate these acts of terror in the community for so long. And as of now, there have been at least 6 identified victims. One who was 13 when the grooming began. And then there was another victim who said that she was offered as a gift to him when she was 15 years old.
It's like trafficked by her own parents.
Yeah.
It's just disgusting.
Yes. So not only is he facing charges here in, the so-called United States, specifically so-called Nevada, he's also being charged in BC, so-called British Columbia and Canada, and that's for an alleged sexual assault that occurred in 2018. So here's maybe even where we can start the conversation about the need for, Indigenous abolition feminism, because here's, a loophole and in the story, or not in the story, but in the, justice and liberation that we need to be demanding, and current takes and approaches and praxis on feminism are not fucking doing it. And which is that, so there's a law in Nevada that, and I don't understand it. I didn't do a ton of research into it, but it's something in Nevada, if you're set a bail, you only have to pay 15% of it. So he was, his bail was set to $300,000, which means he would only have to pay $45,000 to make the bail. And so that doesn't make any sense, for one. And two, it just shows so much the need for just a total abolition of, the police, the courts, judges. The whole system is flawed and skewed towards the continued genocide of Indigenous people, even when it's perpetuated by an Indigenous person. We know that there's Native bootlickers out there. They're in our communities. They're, totally assimilated to their own, our own oppression and some people could say that's part of the survival. But the point I want to make here is that while in larger white liberal feminist conversations, their approach might be that, well, we have to trust in these systems of democracy because they're righteous, they're true, they're just, blah, blah, blah. I legit had someone, here in town, white liberal feminist, be upset with me for outing a sexual abuser during a presentation I was giving. And in the aftermath, she tried to identify where I worked.
Ugh.
And then I ran into her on the street and I was like, you got a problem? I confronted her because I couldn't believe that someone would, be trying to protect a sexual predator in our community. And her response was basically that I should trust the like judicial systems that are in place to like do like our bidding for us.
Boo.
So that's just like, you know, my first and maybe one of my largest critiques of white liberal feminism is that they're like, while they're so busy, like, you know, climbing these corporate ladders and, you know, perpetuating capitalism and exploitation of more vulnerable people, like, they're totally like ignoring how like these systems like specifically impact like Black, Indigenous people, specifically Black and Indigenous queer people, etc. And so like, you know, within this Nathan chasing horse conversation, it doesn't surprise me that there's supporters there in the courtroom, and that, you know, a lot of the media like that's out there about this issue comes from the narratives of the police, and, you know, like kind of dehumanize, like in the process, like dehumanizing the victims, you know, by saying the crimes that he committed were like, you know, this like two counts, this like this two count of this and one count of this. And like, for how long are we going to like rely on, you know, these laws to like scare people into not raping other people? It doesn't like make any sense that we like within, you know, Indigenous abolition communities, and in critique of white liberal feminism, that we would continue to like go to the law, recruit police, etc., for, you know, the like defeating of rape culture.
Like the fact that we even have to like hear about this, or that there's any form of like justice, so-called justice, coming from this, like only because he was arrested by the state.
Right.
Like there was nothing going on like within the like outside communities, because like he was like being protected. And like so that's part of it, is like we have to be able to even like detach ourselves from this, because obviously it's great that people want to pretend that there's some people out there who can always protect us. But just like what Bon was saying, where like that woman came up to you in town, like it reminded me of something from the fanzine, where they brought up that systematically criminalized survivors are not recognized as victims by the state.
Right.
So, and like I just think about like that woman had no idea about the harassment you were already receiving from the state, like because she had no semblance of like what it means to like live in this kind of society, where like of course she thinks that because she's exactly the person that they're working to protect. And with the chasing horse stuff, it really also reminds me of the whole like free Leonard Peltier movement
Mm-hmm.
and like the AIM stuff, where people want to like rally around this like indigenous man who's like doing all this stuff and is like bringing native representation, but like we're completely ignoring the woman who was murdered in this story, and like the indigenous activist who knew these men, and these men had a hand in her murder. And now all of these like native nonprofits and everything, they post like their little like, oh, like free Leonard Peltier graphics and all that. while never addressing where it's all coming from. It's on an individual level.
Yeah, it's also like, it's so disturbing because for years there have been people calling out chasing horse. Like are folks within Indian country who have been trying to alert other people to his predatory behavior for years, and victims who were speaking out, and people trying to warn other communities, like, don't let this guy into your community. He'd been banished from some communities, but he just kept moving around to new places and using the sort of, the longing and desperation that a lot of Native people have for our culture, for our traditions, for our spirituality, as like a weapon to then rape and abuse, taking advantage of people needing to connect with spirituality, needing to connect with medicine, and using that to lure in more victims. And so it's difficult because, like, right now, then some of those people are feeling vindicated that he's finally got arrested by the state, and therefore the state now is saying, yes, they were right. He's a predator and we caught him in the act, and the state is agreeing with some of this evidence. But then it's also reproducing this narrative where we don't believe our own people, we don't believe our own victims, we only believe the cops, and so for some folks who are like, oh, now they're recognizing that he is this problem that people have been saying he always is, just reinforces kind of the silencing of those victims and those witnesses who saw what was going on, saw him being shady, and have been trying to call it out for years. So it's frustrating, because now it's going to get framed as if there's some kind of justice that the state is providing that Native people have failed, that Indian country has failed to provide. Right. And so I think that that's the problem with, like, this idea of, this carceral kind of feminism that happens, where trying to say the state and the cops are going to provide justice for this situation, because we can't get our shit together to do it ourselves, instead of a moment of reflecting on, like, well, as abolitionists, what are the different ways that we can actually do that ourselves? What are the different ways that we can actually create safety, create justice, and challenge the rape culture that's in ceremony circles, that's in the way that heteropatriarchy and creepy dudes have occupied ceremony, and use it to take advantage of other people, and so, like, I think that there's like a spectrum of, it's not just like rape and grooming and trafficking and all the things that he was accused of sit at, like, in isolation from all these other practices of patriarchy and homophobia and transphobia that have embedded themselves in the, like, kind of colonial occupation of our ceremony ways, because a lot of our peoples had traditions that, we've been forced to lose, about what gender, what sexuality means, what are the roles in the medicine that queer people, two-spirit people carry, what is the medicine that women carry. And that gets kind of occupied by a lot of these men taking advantage of the loss of culture that's come from cultural genocide to then, police the way women dress at ceremony, to tell two-spirit people they're not welcome in ceremonies, or they're not allowed to dress how they need to dress, or be who they need to be, or represent themselves in the way that Creator made them, right? And carry the medicine that they are meant to have, and then carry the role that they are supposed to have in our communities. And so I see it as a continuum. Like, there's a lot of these predatory men out there taking advantage of ceremony, calling themselves medicine people, and, perpetuating a lot of sexism and homophobia and transphobia through that. And that's not our tradition, right? That's not our way. That doesn't belong in our ceremony spaces. But for a lot of people, especially like urban people who are trying to reconnect, I've noticed that that seems to be so prevalent. Like, at least on the res, there's different options, right? You might know, you might be able to find a medicine circle, medicine people who are not reproducing some of this stuff. But for a lot of folks that are, growing up outside of their territories, um, unfortunately, like those predators become the gatekeepers to ceremony and to medicine, and that just perpetuates their ability to abuse. So it's like to me, it's like a fundamental abolitionist problem. Like, how do we deal with that issue in a way that doesn't reinforce the power of the state? Because we can't handle our own shit.
Absolutely. And I know in a lot of communities, that's exactly what we are doing. I know, living here in a border town to, you know, Daneta, and like seeing different levels of, intervention. Like, I don't, it's hard to, well, here, let me explain it. So there's a group that I used to be part of called MMDR, which was Missing and Murdered Diné Relatives. And basically, like, what I learned from being part of that group is that almost every person that's been found after missing persons report was found by people in that community, because they were totally left behind, and the police and detective and like course priorities, I guess, if you will. And while like a lot of these families initially went to like the police, went to the reporting, and did the whole kind of like extractive process of like this missing person's life so that it could like maybe be cared about by the system, and then it wasn't, turning like their loved one and their dear relative into another like statistic and a pile of shit that they don't care about at all. These families mobilized themselves in their community to search every corner of anywhere that they thought they could find their relative. And most of the cases, there like was little like police or court you know involvement into the like discovery of these folks. And so here we are at this kind of like interesting like juncture of like within the missing and murdered Indigenous women, Two-Spirit, girl, and trans folks movement, is a lot of people calling for more funding for
Right.
police forces
Yeah, that
too.
it's a problem that will be solved with more police.
Right, exactly.
Or giving up sovereignty to let state police and other local police agencies onto your sovereign territory, and that's going to somehow solve it. Or bringing in more federal government officials, that's going to solve the problem. It's
Right.
not.
That's what feeds the
it's
problem.
Yeah. It's
it feeds the
letting go
problem.
more of your sovereignty is somehow going to protect your people. Like, that doesn't make any sense.
No, and it doesn't make any sense. And so like, like we have these communities, these self-organized communities, like getting shit done, but then still having that belief of like we need to still invest in this system. Like,
Mhm.
so we have this kind of like contradiction sometimes within our movements and within our struggles, because because we're assimilated to white supremacy. We're assimilated
Yeah.
to our own genocide. And so, like, I think in navigating like these worlds and like these approaches to, Indigenous abolition feminism, as something to just really like keep in mind, like where our communities are at. And even though like they might not realize they are literally practicing Indigenous abolition feminism, like on the ground, by organizing these, beautiful moments of like community collectiveness. that they may be afraid to like espouse that, you know, indigenous abolition like label, because as we know in the history of like colonial genocide of like our folks, like anyone who like in the boarding schools, and you know there's like a whole history, and you can listen to some of our other shows about why you know folks might be afraid to be that symbolic or to take on like the role of an abolitionist, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think whether people take on like the name, like say I'm an Indigenous abolitionist feminist or not, like doing the work is what's important, right? Like that folks came together in both of these examples. You know, folks came together to find their missing loved one when, you know, the cops failed. Folks came together to, you know, early on call out this guy and warn other communities and banish him from communities and, you know, try to protect people. Folks, you know, did the work, and the problem is the, you know, the people who didn't listen, right? It's you know, there were people there. Like we can't say that you know it's a failure. You know, in many ways it's a success, you know, where people have been building on holding these folks accountable within community, for a long time. So I think to me it's like if you're doing the work, you're defending, you know, our spiritual ways, you're calling out cis heteropatriarchy in ceremony spaces, you're creating spaces that are safe, you're trying to, you know, create accountability, create justice, find people, then that's the work, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And to clarify too, like, I think it's important that when like we talk about like any kind of like anarchist or abolitionist practice, that like commitment and militancy towards that, like the theory behind the practice is really important. And so like that's why like I think it's so necessary to, you know, be having these conversations outside of like our circles, so that
Mm-hmm.
like for example, like we don't keep like working with cops in our communities. We don't keep like relying on like these systems, and you know the puppet governments that are, you know, committing like fraud against and within our own, you know, so-called nations.
It seems like we need our own structure and communities to like be connecting, and because like we almost need a structure to counter this like structural problem. It feels like sometimes maybe like in individual spaces or individual groups there's a lot of focus on like directly like this is like a local abuser like in the community, and so like only like the locals know about it, and it's still very much like a focus on like interpersonal issues
Mm-hmm.
rather than structural issues. So it's like even though you could have maybe like an abolitionist group doing that, there's still it needs to be spread far and wide, because that's part of the harm reduction is that like the more people know about this, the less this person can go there and cause harm.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what those individual communities decide to do, if those individuals approach their community, is up to them. But it still just seems like and it's hard because like in capitalism we're taught to be like hyper individualistic. It's hard to move like our way of thinking away from just like interpersonal conflict and towards these like bigger connections. I think about how like basically in my culture and probably in a lot of other cultures we basically say that like talking shit is sacred because
Yes.
It
because
is. Yeah.
if we're sitting around talking to each other, then people know, people are informed,
Exactly.
and that like part of like how the state silences us is by trying to like stamp out those like oral networks, which starts like with things like our language, but also just like shutting down and endlessly harassing and infiltrating more radical movements. Yeah, and it's not just like the individualism isn't just like at like, oh, like from a perspective of like sexual violence, but also literally everything that we're dealing with, because that's like the cornerstone of white feminism, is that like you yourself can be a feminist, and that's feminism. Because like, I don't know, you have like a feminist personality. I don't even know.
What the fuck is it even?
Right?
Like,
So yeah. And I think
Yeah.
also, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say I always interpreted indigenous feminism as being about us, you know, as about our community, as about our people, you know. And so I think to me that's always the difference. It's not an individual like me, I'm a feminist, you know. But I'm for the liberation of our people. I'm for the liberation of our land. You know?
Mhm.
I think also like a lot of the like hyper individualistic like white feminism leads a lot of people to like actually really like far right like transphobic beliefs as well.
Mhm.
Because like when I think of white feminism, I also think of like TERFs.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if we want to get into that,
Let's break down that word for some folks
yeah,
who haven't heard it.
Good call.
a
Anyone want to
trans
jump?
exclusionary radical feminist, which a lot of people over time have kind of just been like, it's a word that has been used kind of just, I feel like, out of convenience, maybe, because like we know that these people aren't feminists deep down. Like, in fact, they're doing everything they can to like reinforce patriarchy, right? Because like the whole thing is about like bioessentialism, and like a cornerstone of white supremacy is bioessentialism. And yes, I kind of like to use that word because it gets a lot more to the point of like what their ideology is around. And it
Mhm.
also like gets to the point that it's a highly like racist ideology. And like bioessentialism historically comes from like white supremacist racist ideas that like humans only come in two rigid sexes, which biologically predetermines your personality, your capacity to do harm,
Mhm.
gender roles, literally everything like that. So by rejecting bioessentialism, we're also rejecting white supremacy. We're rejecting like
Because it's
everything that
like
colonizers.
eugenics,
Yeah,
right?
Eugenics.
exactly.
Yeah, like saying because of your racially, you know, your race is a biological idea and therefore you're inferior to white people, which we know is biologically not true, right? There's no biological things as race and even gender. A lot of scientists who really study biology are skeptical that it's even a biological thing, you know. But yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, I love that term. Thank you for offering that.
Yeah, of
That's
course.
it allows me to see like the connection between racism and sexism a lot, and like and transphobia and queerphobia like a lot more clearly. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, like it's almost like through the objectification of like our just like visible bodies, like that can then determine like who and what we are, when that's actually like who and what we are is like such a spiritual like experience that's directly related to every single thing around us, like the skies, the land, the waters, each other. And so yeah, it's just such a like within the constructs of like, you know, race and gender, like it just feels like just even more dehumanizing to be like, and you know, in some ways I will say, like, as I was like coming out and like seeing beyond the binary, I guess, if you will, a lot of those like terms within like queer communities like really helped me kind of like come to like how I understand or about myself, but not necessarily like determining like what I am exactly. And so, yeah, I think words are super powerful, but also feelings and experiences are, you know, connected to like spirit. And so we have to make sure that we're not like getting caught up in this like jumbo of like, you know, constructed identities and things like that. I know it can be like super affirming for folks too.
Yeah, but like I like the point that you were bringing up though, about how that ideology, that kind of, you know, colonial white supremacist like ideology of bioessentialism, like how pervasive that is, that people have been assimilated forcibly to that idea and then internalize it and then regurgitate it as if it's somehow part of our indigenous culture or our way of seeing the world. And I think a lot of like, you know, there are sort of these, even I would say like kind of mainstreamy ways of thinking about feminism or even indigenous feminism that definitely do that. You know, they definitely reinforce a very kind of colonial idea of what feminism is.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah, that's super true. Like even within like, yeah, the MMIW D2ST movement, like I know people who are like almost seemingly on purpose still calling it MMIW, just missing and murdered Indigenous women, instead of like choosing, you know, like relatives or people or, you know, something that just includes like the potential for that to happen to any of us.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And also like the reality, right? That queer and trans and two-spirit people are targeted, you know?
mhm. Yeah.
It leads right back to like the bioessentialism, like, oh, you'll only be targeted for sexual violence if you have like these certain traits, which it's harmful to people of all genders, and that definitely like feeds into like the like white feminist idea of like, oh, like we're just like against men, or like we just, I don't, you know, like hating men as a like cornerstone for your feminism, when like they turn right back around and like reproduce the exact same power structures that they claim to be against.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, and it's just reproducing like the ways that, you know, cis het men hate women. Right? It's not actually challenging like, you know, the construction of like oppression, gender-based oppression and sexual violence.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like some of the like thinking of just like the things that reinforce you know, like I guess like the gender binary and you know, colonial like understandings of gender is absolutely like the police and court systems.
Mm-hmm.
When we look at, you know, research, which I think like most data is all like very extractive to begin with, but just looking at, you know, like the movement in terms of like numbers, like I don't even want to know how many like people were just like shoved into like the category of being a man or the category of being a woman when their body was found. You know,
Right.
like we don't know, like those are queer relatives that just got shoved into like this you know, one of the biggest purveyors of like the continual like oppression of who we are and like the continual genocide of who we are. And like I think that just like addresses another like need, which is happening in our communities, for us to like develop our own like ways of accounting for everyone who's been stolen from us, with our own
Mhm.
like ways of recording and you know, things like that, and working outside of the systems that are in place as of now.
And also like recognizing like that this, you know, the police state is, you know, fundamentally has this colonial history of genocide against our people, of coming out of, you know, slavery, chattel slavery, and you know, created as a force to capture fugitive Black people who are trying to escape to liberation. You know, and so I think like it's just such a contradiction to me to go to the police or to the state for safety from sexual violence when cops so many times are the perpetrators of
God.
domestic violence and sexual violence. Like going back to current events, like the news coverage coming out of the UK about they found out that these cops had been raping people for years. You know, and there's two cops that now they're like arresting and trying to do something with. But it started this whole conversation of in that country of people coming out and being like, oh yeah, like the cops are more scary. Like the cops are the rapists. Like this is something everybody's know. And no one's gonna go to them, you know, for safety. And so it's, you know, to me, that's the contradiction. Like, of course, they're going to fail in finding relatives. Of course, they're going to fail in creating safety and protecting vulnerable people, especially vulnerable people like folks in the sex industry or folks who are, you know, unhoused, you know, people who are repeatedly the subjects of police violence.
I would even say that the state is the greatest purveyor of sexual violence. Like, sexual violence is like it is an essential tool to the state to enforce patriarchy. And I think the more it's thought about as something that really can't be like separated from like incarceration and the state and things like that, the more
Mm-hmm.
we'll be moving towards like an abolitionist perspective. As long as we know like these cops are way more likely to rape than to bring a rapist to justice. And I don't know what happens because I see this like getting said all the time, but
Mm-hmm.
then time and time again, it always returns back to this person finally got arrested, or like, what can we do to put this person in jail? Or where does it go wrong? I guess is my question. Like, we start with this belief and then we end up completely somewhere else.
Yeah.
I think that that's like those are the hard questions like for transformative justice work. Like I don't know, I've been a part of a lot of different transformative justice and community accountability processes, and when someone's like at that level of violence, you know, we're not just dealing with an activist who's like creating havoc in a community, but someone who is like, you know, raping and harming and threatening to shoot someone or threatening to blow someone up, or you know, these some of the situations that I've observed, we end up being at a loss of like, what do we do? Like, because we don't have the tight knit communities that we used to have, where banishment really was a punishment equal to death, you know, social death. Just getting kicked out of a community almost doesn't matter anymore because then they just go prey on another community. So, I mean, going back to like what you were saying, Taloa, about needing to have the infrastructure, needing to have the networks, you know, across communities so that we've got some type of structure so people can't just bounce around, is important. But also, where I see it sort of get into gray areas is then, you know, like talking to folks about like these hard like situations, there's also this like gut reaction to some folks that okay, well this is a situation where we need like hood justice, we're just going to go beat that person up, or we're just going to go use violence to shut down violence. And then that doesn't solve the problem either, though. That just kind of reproduces, like, oh, some form of patriarchal violence, like getting all your cousins to go beat them up is going to be the solution, and that's not either. That just reinforces heteropatriarchy. And so I think it's like this, I don't know, it's a tough question. Like, what do we do with someone who is a rapist, is trying to murder people, you know? Like, what can we draw on to protect ourselves from that?
I mean, I remember hearing a relative, chosen relative, talk about like her dad going up to the family pedophile, shotgun to his head, and didn't pull the trigger. And an antithesis to what you had just said, that broke my heart. That broke my heart that he couldn't do it. And I saw no reason for that man to see the light of another day ever again. I really didn't. And to what point, like I think, and like in support of what you were saying of like, if someone's like to that point, like, what are you supposed to do without relying on a carceral system where he gets a prison sentence?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know if that's not necessarily what I'm saying, like that I'm like is the foundation of like my thoughts on it or anything like that, but like, yeah, just in that moment I was just like, man. And in thinking of like, almost every person that I know has been abused by somebody, and that really like most violent way. And so many of those people, like Nathan Chasenhorse, are regarded as, these protectors in the community, people who would never do anything like that, so on and so forth. Like, what are we supposed to do? And like, yeah, it's just such a conversation that seems like it has like so many different approaches to it.
I would ask the question, is like the violence of self-defense the same as state violence? Right?
No.
Like,
yeah, definitely not.
Like if someone like fights back against their abuser, that is not like something that we would consider like, oh, like they abuse that person back. Like, I think like emphasis on like the right to self-defense, but also the fact that like it is up to those individual communities, because I kind of like lean towards the side of, well, we got to do what we got to do to protect children and to protect the people like who are being targeted by this person. And yeah, it's really hard because there's also like a lot of emotions like that crop up when like those kinds of conversations come up. And I think it's also good to like welcome those emotions instead of trying to push them away or like take like a logical approach to the problem. I think it needs a little bit of both, where like mainly we're centering like the voices, the feelings, and the needs of the victims, which where we're at right now, we're not even like in a place where victims can like safely name their abuser and know that like they can be safe and that they can say that person's name without someone trying to figure out where they work or something like that. So maybe like moving the conversation from like what do we do with them, and more like opening the discussion around what accountability would look like for the victims. Which, if the victims are children, that's another question. So I'm just, if you gotta go beat up a rapist, you gotta go beat him up. I don't.
Yeah, I mean,
But you're
yeah,
absolutely right.
no,
Like
I feel you. Like, I
that
mean,
doesn't.
yeah, in a personal way, like, I'm with you 100%. Like, I'm like, all right, kick his ass, but like, to whatever we have to do to make people safe in the moment. But then I just think structurally, though,
Right,
in
exactly.
a
Because
structurally kind of preventative sense, like, how do we just get them to stop raping
Oh
us? How do we
yeah.
just get them to stop, like,
Right. Which, yeah,
killing
totally.
us? Like,
totally. Which is like the antithesis of like what would be, again referring to like a white liberal approach of like take karate classes or get pepper spray or blah, 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 blah. Like,
yeah, don't blame the victim. Like,
yeah. Don't put your drink on like the bar.
go buy a gun.
Go buy a gun. Which
Like, okay,
I
all
am.
right.
I mean, I am a gun owner, and I love
if that's what
having
you want to
them.
do, but
Like,
I think it's reckless to tell people to do that
well, yeah,
without being like, there's a lot of like work that goes into doing something like that, and like there's practice. It's also like it can like put you up for like being harassed by the state, like if they know that you own a gun. So yeah, not to mention like if we're talking about cops as rapists, that's not.
Yeah, well, cops are rapists and murderers.
I mean, yeah, but it's like, I think that gets to like some of the conversations about like, I don't really like the reformist language of it, but where folks have been demanding to like defund or disband, like, at least they're coming from a framework of like, let's disempower their power to kill us. Let's take it away, let's take it back, and try to think about that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like how we saw with like what's been in the aftermath of like the slaying of Tort, like it just kind of almost feels like there's no like, and which all this all actually every part of this conversation too, I just want to point out, has like huge foundations in capitalism. I mean, this like training facility is like a $90 million project backed by tons of corporations, which will generate tons of money into the area because they'll ship people probably from not just only the so-called US, but everywhere to like train.
Yeah, it'll be like School of the Americas for pigs,
Yeah. Yeah, it's going to be the largest pig pen in the forest. And so it's like like at what like where do we like how do we like negotiate, like how do we negotiate like that, like under this current administration with the current occupant of the White House, like granting the most like funding to the militarization of the police and the continued murder of like Black and Indigenous people at the hands of these like now like really advanced like police operations. And like it's just like, I know earlier we were kind of like critiquing the question of like, well, what do we do now, or what do we do with them, but it is like on, an organizational, as again, as someone committed to Indigenous abolition feminism, it's a conversation that we really need to look at and start really practicing what we can do on the ground. And for me, that's creating communities of care, which were the circumstances in which Tort was murdered out there when I went and visited so-called Atlanta at the People's Park in Weelaunee Forest. They had coordinated mutual aid efforts, they had coordinated medic services, they had coordinated meals, coordinated groceries. I mean, it was a beautiful display of an alternative to, living in this colonial capitalistic world. And we know that the creation of that and the defense of that is what got Tort murdered. And so, and obviously in connection to protecting people, the environment there, the land there, etc., from colonial extraction and desecration.
I mean, it's such this. I mean, it's almost you couldn't come up with a more visceral metaphor, right? You've got sacred Muskogee and Cherokee land, a forest next to low income Black community in the town where Martin Luther King preached and had his church. You've got these Black and Indigenous relations with this sacred forest that are so important, and then here comes all these cops trying to build a military fortress to take the forest away from the Black people and the Muskogee people and the Cherokee people, and put up a military base in which to terrorize that community, terrorize that Black community. It's so fucking obvious that this is wrong. You can't come up with you're what?
I also think about how those trees are old growth forest. And so that means those are the mother trees of the whole southeastern ecosystem. It's not it's not even just a forest. It is
exactly.
It is, and right there with the Mississippi River, that is the mouth of life in the southeast. If we keep part of our indigenous feminism is mainly land and water defense, because if we if we aren't defending the land and the water, that's the most basic thing that we have to do to protect ourselves from colonial extraction, because there won't be any harm reduction if we have nothing to drink, right? I also think of the railway explosion disaster happening in so-called Ohio right now.
Right in
And
Appalachia.
The whole first of all, that it could have been prevented.
Right.
That since last year and probably earlier, I just haven't found sources from earlier, railroad union workers have been saying that this type of accident can and will happen if they don't make a change. And then, like you were saying, the current occupiers of the White House did everything in their power. Oh, by the way, including our favorite girl bosses in Congress, they also voted to. They voted to strike down the strike, and now we're here on the cusp of an ecological disaster that we really can't even begin to know the consequences. It is. I almost don't know what to say.
It wasn't, so obvious that they're just trying to kill us, right? And trying to kill the land at the same time.
And the fact that it was a low-income town.
Yep.
And it's not even just that town. It's the whole state. and the whole like Ohio River basin, the water has been poisoned, the air has been poisoned, the land has been poisoned, and like it's so much to where I wouldn't be surprised if like within the next few months we even like have consequences like in the Southwest, just
Oh.
because of like the way the weather works. And then you know that eventually like that goes to the ocean, and like birds eat fish, and like the animals eat the poison plants, and like it's poisoning not only our wildlife, like our food sources, our water sources. It, my cat
Aw.
broke into the room.
I
But
mean,
Mhm.
I'm
yeah,
sure your
and
cat
then
is in agreement, though.
He-
oh
This
no, she
being a
is.
serious issue
She
for
most definitely
animals.
is.
Yeah.
There's been almost a complete media blackout in terms of like the actual consequences, because everything that I've seen has just been like, oh, like there was an explosion, there was a chemical explosion, and like the town had to evacuate, and like that's it. But just from some environmentalists and some chemists that I've seen, they're like, y'all, this is bad. And so all of these like needs to defend the land and water just like keep popping up and keep popping up, because like we have to understand that they're not gonna stop. Like they'll extract every last, I don't even know what, and they'll stomp everyone else like under their boot. And so besides awareness, like how are we going to actually like put ourselves out there and be physically there for those land defense movements? Because we often see like women and like trans native folks are usually the ones like out there on the front lines
Yep.
at land defense events, like getting harassed and brutalized by the police. Like, why do we have to be the ones?
I
Not
think
to
that's
mention, like, we're not enough. We
Mhm.
need other people to help us.
Mhm.
Like, and also to take over sometimes, because it
Shit's
shouldn't,
exhausting.
literally, like, they want to, like, oh, like, go talk about, like, they're so, like, connected and, like, they go to ceremony and all this, but, like, they haven't said a word about sacred sites being destroyed as they speak. And it's again like going back to like that hyper individualistic, like, oh, I'm gonna like make a living as like a native influencer, and like just like kind of talk
Mhm.
about this stuff but not really do anything about it, because
Yeah.
like settlers love it when I like make a speech on Instagram Live or whatever. But
Exactly.
what we're about, which is returning the land to who knows how to take care of it, they don't like that so much, because settlers have this entitlement to the land and the animals around them. And I think that like entitlement, and there also like needs to be, I think, education around how capitalism has like disconnected us mentally from the land, and how a lot of people don't understand that like the earth gives us everything that we need to live. Like we don't need anything extra. Like we have all of these gifts, and yet we like pour concrete on top of it. I think
Right.
like
Like the ingratitude of it is just
Mhm.
so
Truly.
appalling.
and the thing is like we as indigenous people can really like feel it on a like a deep down level, like because a lot of us like within our recent family histories remember distinctly being disconnected from the land, and how much that hurt, and how much like fallout it causes in families and communities for like those things to no longer be available, or for the land to be poisoned to where they can't even go back there anymore. I literally, I can't imagine the grief. I think something that I feel like should also be discussed is like the grief that comes with all of this. Like, yes, like we're fighting and we're angry like 99% of the time, but sometimes like where does all that pain go? Like, I think that's something that also like needs to be like shared amongst us. I think due to like colonialism and just like people being disconnected from communities, and also like specific colonial traumas like with boarding schools and with being adopted out and things like that, people, there's like a this avoidance of like shame or different emotions that come with it, which I think again is also like very capitalistic. Like when I think about like the practice of psychiatry and how like, okay, like you're depressed, so here's these pills. Well, people are depressed because they've been disconnected from their culture. And on an even more obvious level, because they don't even have access to clean water, or they live in a food desert, or like, I don't know. There's a lot here in terms of like, it's not a disorder to be upset that
Yeah.
the land is being poisoned. It's not a disorder to like be angry about it or to want these things to end. So yeah, obviously I think it keeps the fire going even more when people can like talk about these really heavy emotions and then feel that they are held, and that like, you know, even though we do go through this really hard stuff, we still have this fighting spirit. Like we're not gonna give up, because there is no choice but to end this.
Yeah. I think that's such a great point, especially in relation to, you know, like the protest against Native American or just Native mascots. Like, I don't think people understand the pain that we experience, and then therefore don't understand why something that seems so, you know, like nonviolent would hurt so bad, would hurt us so bad. And like when, you know, like they don't understand like the symbol of like the power of like our symbolism, like, and when that's made a mockery of and made money off of, and then leads to, you know, our own people fucking selling out so they can do a dance for ESPN. There's people behind those, you know, charades that are like trying to protect what we have left.
And
And
it's
so,
not like, yeah, it's not distant history, right? Like, so there are so
no.
many folks that I know, like, I mean, in my own community, where my own family, where we still talk about ancestors who survived the massacres, you know? Like, there's things that people carry that are still very close, you know? It's not a long time ago,
Mhm.
you know? It's not out of living memory. And because those stories have been passed to us by a grandparent who heard it from their parent or their grandparent, you know, it's not that long ago, right?
I also remember like my mom talking to me about how like when she was a kid she was like watching Tom and Jerry, and there was like, you know, like the like racist caricature of like, oh, like an Indian, and she said that she just remembered feeling so embarrassed, like, to be Native. And that just, like, really messed me up because, like, that definitely, like, perpetuated for me. Like, for a while, I was like, well, I just, like, don't want to talk about this because, like, maybe it's too painful, or, yeah, again, like she felt embarrassed. Like this was something that was violent against her, and instead, like, she felt shame. And, like, we got to get the shame out.
Yes, yes, yes. I think such a big part of, reclaiming what feminism is for ourselves and our communities has so much to do with like transforming those assimilations.
Mhm.
I mean, really, sometimes like I know we could be so much more powerful as communities when we unlearn and untangle a lot of those, internalized like conditions and stereotypes of ourselves.
And it's also like at the core, sorry to interrupt, but it's also at the core of like where these issues intersect, right? Like the mascots are built on these sexist, colonial white supremacist ideas of a gender binary between a brave and an S word. I don't even want to say it, you know? And there's this like over sexualization involved in them, and you see it, you see it, you saw it at the Super Bowl where like these white women are over sexualizing themselves with pink headdresses and little outfits, trying to represent themselves as an S word, and like that's their idea of indigeneity, is like an inherently rapeable femme body. And then on the other side of it we have murdered and missing indigenous relatives, right? And so it's just, and they're reproducing these like ideas of like, violence with the tomahawk chop as if it's some type of, blame the victim. Like again, like they dehistoricize the issue, like claiming that we're the ones who invented scalping. Actually, the British invented it to colonize the Irish hundreds of years before they even came to our lands, and then they brought it with them, and they kept doing it, and so that comes from them, but they put those violent stereotypes on us, and then that reproduces like the actual material violence that people are going through now. So, just to connect, like it's not just about representation. It's not just, we're not just saying like we don't like this mascot because it relates to this long ago history, or it relates to a stereotype, but it relates to the violence right now that they're perpetuating against our people.
And what surprise do we have from this coming from the NFL itself? Like, if we want to get into that and how the NFL like preys on Black communities in order to like make young Black men feel like they have like a way out of poverty, or like a way to not go to prison. Oh, just like destroy your body for sports, for for like a mostly white spectacle. It's like the violence doesn't even end with the mascots. It's ingrained in the very thing. And again, it's like all this on stolen land. So
Totally.
we don't even want to abolish the mascot. We want to abolish the NFL.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
They wouldn't
like,
survive in a Toka game anyway. Our sports are rugged.
well, like speaking of like the players themselves, like I think it's so weird to me, and actually my boyfriend pointed this out to me, that like how they're so like homophobic. Like they're so homophobic, transphobic, very cis, very het, very straight boys, high schoolers that never grew up really, who like do what I would like consider pretty like gay things. Like I was like he had put on like the highlights from the show, and I was like watching like the way that they like congratulated each other, like the way they like ramped each other up, the way they like
All the
just
booty
like
touching.
all
Yeah.
the
Oh yeah. All the
butts,
smacks.
like the smacking. I was like, there's no way. Like, how is this? And not to mention, oh my gosh, yeah, not to mention too. Sorry, like on the field in one of the goalposts or whatever the fuck they're called. I don't know anything about football. Like the Chiefs had literally written on the field "end racism."
It's on their helmets too.
It's on their helmets too.
Yes, on every
Oh
single
my
helmet it says
God.
"end racism." Meanwhile,
Well, then end your freaking mascot. Like, what the hell? You can't-
oh, okay. So I
you
guess
can't
we're
have
just
those
gonna
two things
forget.
together.
We'll just
No.
forget about how Colin Kaepernick was blacklisted.
Right.
Yeah, I guess we'll just forget about that. But end racism, though, guys. We at the NFL support ending racism and ending traumatic brain injuries.
And yet,
Here we are.
Yeah. Well, I honestly can't thank you two enough for, being part of this conversation today. I hope these conversations continue. And if there's any, last words of encouragement that we might be able to, share with listeners and people who are just out there in the struggle, experiencing all of these things going on, whether directly or vicariously, it's a lot to fucking handle.
it is.
It's a lot to talk about.
It is. Yeah.
It is.
Make
I
sure
would
you
just
have
try to
some
say,
medicine.
yeah, exactly. Don't go through it alone. Don't go through it alone.
No.
Because we can't get through this without each other. That is for sure.
That is for sure. Yes.
Yeah, you need friends, you need support, you need medicines with you, it's time to light your smudge and, do a little self-care. And also, to celebrate each other, like wanted to give a shout out to the awesome Native relative who reclaimed a headdress at the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
Saw that footage. That was pretty badass. To all the folks who are still protecting the forest, still going out there, still caring for each other, caring for their community, to all the Muskogee and Cherokee relatives who are going out there to do Stomp again, to celebrate, to practice their ways in their homelands, and to all the community that's coming out to say no. We give a lot of love and medicine to all the survivors out there. We know this is a heavy show, so just we're lighting our sage for you.
Yes, and please don't forget to carve out time and every day for yourself. Don't forget to write. Don't forget to make art, sing, dance, connect with people. I think a huge cornerstone of a radical feminism is that element of taking care.
Mm-hmm.
And we can really thank our Black ancestral kin and our own ancestral relatives for showing us those ways too. And I say all of that because I feel like a lot of activism is just it reproduces patriarchy so much, and it's more of a doing something than a living something. And we have to live in balance of what we're here to do, and also in nurturing ourselves and our communities too. So practice emotional intelligence. Google it. Google what it is. Start, identifying
Part of
your
it starts with
feelings.
us. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, if we can't communicate on an individual basis, how are we gonna communicate like as this bigger structure? It does definitely start within, and part of like Indigenous abolition is also recognizing that health isn't just physical, that like there's different aspects to the health. And like I would just say to people out there to also like make sure that your spiritual health is like being taken care of, because at like my lowest points, like having like my ancestors and like my prayer there for me has been completely transformative in how I've been able to move forward. Like just not even like in my own individual personal life, but also like overall. Like it really gives me that inner strength. Like it's not just about like, oh, like make sure you're getting enough sleep, but also, you know, taking care of like the inside and taking care of the spirit as well is really important.
Yes.
We need to
And
heal.
yes.
Absolutely.
And it just so happens today that it's Valentine's Day, and we're force fed this idea that, you know, love is something that can be bought, happiness is something that can be bought. But really, like, you know, going back to what everyone has shared here today, that it really starts with building an intelligence within yourself and with spirit, with land, with the sky, with non-human relatives, plants, animals, each other, etc. And yeah, with that, again, thank you both. I hope we can have more conversations. I really enjoyed learning from you two and being in relation and community with you.
Sam, thank you so much.
Machki, thank you so much.
All right. Well, until next time.
All right.
You can find this broadcast on any of the usual podcast platforms or at indigenousaction.org/podcast.
Email us pics of burning cop cars, burning churches, burning forts, or any questions or topics you'd like to hear us go claws out on at iainfo@protonmail.com.